All right, so this page is a collaboration with Stefan Lindberg and also with Lucia Tuscordna, who's a Uruguayan graduate student at Notre Dame. And speaking to this audience of practitioners, I don't have to tell you that context matters. You can't take the same approach to democratization in every part of the world. And part of the context that matters is the international context. Countries are not isolated, self-contained units. Instead, they're embedded in networks involving other countries that have some influence over their prospects for democratization. One of the networks in which countries are embedded is a network of neighbors, those immediate geographic neighbors. And I've looked at this in the past, and I found that neighbors tend to become more alike. That is, if you're surrounded by democracies, then you tend to become more democratic. If you're surrounded by non-democracies, you tend to become less democratic. But there are different kinds of networks. So here, for example, is a set of colonial networks. Colonial networks connect a colonizer, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, etc., to colonies and, after independence, to former colonies. So they link all these countries together. And obviously, colonial powers powerfully shaped the form of government that prevailed during colonial rule, but even after independence, these countries remain linked in networks that contain ties of language, religion, trade, migration, communication, and other kinds of things that link countries together. And colonizers and former colonies are, in a sense, still connected to each other, and probably, in some senses, more connected to each other than countries that are similar to them but happen not to be part of that empire. So the question is, do these networks matter for democratization? And if they do matter, do these countries tend to become more similar, that is, do they converge, or do they tend to become more different, that is, diverging, moving in the opposite direction that immediate neighbors do? Now, there are some reasons to expect that they would converge. It could be because colonial rule pulled the colonies up through transfers of population, of technology, cultural change, education of Africans at Oxford and the Sorbonne, etc. Those kinds of things you might expect to pull up the colonies. Or it could be the opposite, that the colonies pull the colonizers down because of the burdens of empire. It's difficult to spend money maintaining the empire and sending people there and trying to put down rebellions and things like that. That could have a cost for the democracy and the colonizer. But there are also reasons to expect that maybe colonial rule fostered divergence. That is, these were, after all, inherently unequal relations of power between colonizers and colonies. And that would lead you to expect that colonies were pushed down and colonizers were pushed up. They benefited from colonial rule, and some would say even after colonial rule, some of these relationships might have persisted. Here's a look at some means from V-Dem data. And we find that divergence seems to be the dominant tendency if you're looking at averages. So the blue lines are the averages in the V-Dem Electoral Democracy Index for all countries that were colonizers, Britons and Frances and Germany's, Portugal's, Belgium, etc. The red lines are for the countries that are or were colonies. The black line is for all countries, these are our reference cases, the ones that were neither colonizers nor colonies. And you can see that both the colonizers and the colonies became more democratic over the course of the 20th century and beyond, but the colonizers democratized at a faster rate than the colonies during this period. And so the overall tendency is toward divergence. But that's a really simple analysis. But this conclusion holds up if we do a more sophisticated analysis. That is, if we distinguish between the top-down effects of the colonizers on the colonies and the bottom-up effects of the colonies on the colonizers, and we distinguish between active colonial rule and networks, and the continuing networks that tie those countries together. And by the way, measuring the act of colonial rule is something that only V-Dem data can do, because only we have data on the colonial period. We also distinguish among 9 different empires: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, what am I forgetting? United States is in there as well. And most crucially, looking at whether the size of the democracy gap between countries explains subsequent changes in democracy levels. So here's the result of the more rigorous testing that we did that looks at all of these fine-grained distinctions. And the way to read this is there's one little plot for each empire, Belgian, British, French, etc. And I'm not going to go in too much detail. I guess I will say this, that the blue lines pertain to the periods of active colonial rule, the red lines pertain to periods of former colonial networks. The darker lines are for the colonizer, and the lighter lines are for the colonies. And the thing to look for is whether these lines tend to diverge, or whether they converge, which would look like that, or whether they just stay flat and stay the same. And I think you can see at a glance that in some cases there's no significant change, that it's just a flat line. But most of the time, the lines diverge. And in no case, in none of these empires, do we observe any convergence, that is, the colonizers and their colonies becoming more similar. And usually, there's both a push-up effect of the colonies helping, perhaps involuntarily helping the colonizers become more democratic, and there's often a push-down effect in which the colonizers hinder democratization in the colonies relative to the countries that were untouched by colonial rule. In fact, this model is saying that the bigger the gap is between the colonizer and the colonies, the more they diverge. If they're at the same level, then there's no pressure and neither one affects the other. And this is not just a legacy of the past. These are forces that are still active and influencing democratization today. So this is one answer to the question of whether the wealthy democracies of the world can affect democratization in the developing world. They can, and they have, and it has not been positive. But a more concrete finding, not concrete, but a more useful finding might be that it could promote some mutual understanding, that some of the democracy in the former colonizers has come at the expense of the former colonies. And therefore, it takes some extra effort to overcome that continuing legacy.